Another difference between crystals and polymers is how they respond to heat. A crystalline compound like ice, like a small molecule compound like ice, has a very well-defined melting point and a very well-defined boiling point. So if I take cold ice and heat it up to 0°C, the ice gets warmer up until 0°C. And then as I apply more heat to it, the ice does never get hotter than 0°C. It melts. Once I've melted all the ice, then I get water. I heat up the water until it gets to 100, and then I'm not superheating water, it just starts to evaporate, and then eventually I'm heating steam. Polymers typically don't work like that. A cold polymer that's generally amorphous is a glass, right? So a glass is a stiff compound where we do not have a regular arrangement of polymers. Again, you know what glass is like. It's brittle, it might be strong, it is absolutely not flexible. All right? When we heat that glass up, if you think about if you've seen molten glass, it doesn't go from solid glass to liquid right away, right? It goes soft, it gets rubbery, and that's what happens here. Once we cross the glass transition temperature, we get from a glassy compound to something that might be a little bit more flexible, and might be a little rubbery, maybe even a little sticky past that. Okay. Again, if you can also go the other way. If you take a rubber ball and drop it in liquid nitrogen, then it's easy to smash that rubber ball. Have you ever seen something dipped in liquid nitrogen and then smashed like it's brittle? That's an example of crossing back across the glass transition temperature. Okay? And then eventually, yes, if we keep heating up our rubber, we will liquefy that, but there's no really well-defined boiling or melting point. You might think that we always want to design our plastics with high glass transition temperatures, but that's not always the case. If I want to design some rubber that's going to be soft to the touch or something that's going to be really flexible, then I need a pretty low TG because I don't want it to be glassy. The way I'm going to do that oftentimes is to use a plasticizer. So plasticizer is just a small molecule. Really any will work, but there are some that seem to work better than others. That's a small molecule that's going to fit in between polymer chains to prevent crystallinity. So if you go back to the crystalline picture we had before, now if I've got this weird looking molecule that's like jamming up my crystal, now I'm not going to have that kind of glassy, very crystalline behavior. So there are many common plasticizers. One very common one is diethylhexyl phthalate, this thing. When people talk about phthalates, PHTH, phthalates are very commonly used in general as plasticizers. And you can, if you've heard about plasticizer leaching, it makes sense, right? Just like a small molecule can get into this, it can also get out. So eventually, if these things are volatile, it'll just evaporate out between the chains. Or, if I boil it in water, the water might leach out that plasticizer. And very often, these plasticizers make up a pretty sizable percentage of the mass of the plastic overall. So when people talk about new car smell, that's because the plastic interior of cars, especially older cars, that can be maybe 30% plasticizer. And that plasticizer is evaporating in a closed car as it sits on the lot. And so when you open the door, then you're exposed to all this sort of volatile plasticizer in there. And that's kind of what new car smell is. Okay? And so, yes, and so you also see this in old cars, old car dashes, how when a plastic's been sitting in the sun for a long time, it gets really brittle. This is one reason for that, right? Because when sitting out, you've evaporated all your plasticizer out of it, and now it's crystalline again, which means it's brittle. So plasticizers fill an important role, but there are some drawbacks and some health concerns, right? There are some health concerns with phthalates in general. And there are also some broader environmental concerns with these things getting into the groundwater, which they have definitely done so. And so moving forward as a society, we have lots of conversations to have about how to get the materials we want to get in an environmentally sustainable and reasonable way. What if we want to engineer a plastic with a high TG? So if you think about the movie Days of Thunder with Robert Duvall and Tom Cruise, it's about NASCAR racing, and it's amazing. But one of the plot points there is that their tires keep melting because of the way Tom Cruise is driving, because he's a scamp. Now, what makes tires melt? Well, as tires get hotter, right, we're crossing so far past that glass transition temperature that now we're trying to liquefy our tires. And thinking from a molecular standpoint, we can kind of think of this as polymer chains sliding past each other, right? That's what liquefaction is we're be able to overcome the van der Waals forces between these chains until eventually it's going to act like a liquid. So if I want a high TG, I want to prevent these chains from sliding past each other. So the best way to do that is to essentially tie them to each other. So for instance, here's the first polymer that we'll draw. This is natural rubber, polyisoprene. This is how we usually talk about polymers, is we'll draw the repeating unit and then an N here. We're not going to specify what N is most of the time. Just assume that N is big, right? Hundreds to thousands big. And because N is so big, we're really not going to stress out about what's outside the walls here, right? So as a percentage of the total, there's very, very little on the edges and a whole lot that's not on the edges. So again, as we draw polymers, we just draw the repeating unit, put a wall around it, put N, don't worry about what's outside the wall. Okay, so this is natural rubber. This is what comes out of the rubber tree. If you've ever had a natural rubber eraser, you know that it can get a little bit sticky and tacky, especially in a little bit warm weather. And so this would make a bad car tire, because as soon as you got it even a little bit warm, it would start to liquefy on the road. So, Goodyear tires. Mr. Goodyear's enduring contribution to the world was the process of vulcanization. In vulcanization, we take natural rubber and we heat it with sulfur. And sulfur ends up making bridges between chains. We call these cross-links. This is cross-linking, right? So those sulfur chains, that's not the strongest bond in the world, but it's strong enough, and there's enough of them where it largely prevents these chains from sliding all the way past each other. And so it dramatically raises our melting point and our glass transition temperature. Right? So if I want to engineer something that's going to be really resistant to heat, cross-linking is how it's going to work. This also has shows up in other ways. Hair permanence, right? The way a hair permanent works is essentially you apply a reducing agent to break up the natural sulfur-sulfur linkages between hair proteins, and then you put the hair in the shape you want, and then you apply an oxidant to reform the sulfur-sulfur linkages to hold the hair in the way you want it. That's how perms work. Also, eggs, right? Think about it. When you heat an ice cube, it goes from solid to liquid. When you heat eggs, they go from liquid to solid. How? This is how, right? So your proteins in eggs start like this, and then when you heat it up, two things happen. First, those proteins begin to denature, and so they get a little bit longer. But also, you've got all these sulfur groups kind of sticking off the side, and as you keep heating it, you're going to form sulfide bridges between polymer chains, right? So you are cross-linking your protein chains if you overcook your eggs. So don't overcook your eggs. 3 minutes in boiling water, perfect poached egg. There you go. You're welcome. To summarize, we can design our molecular structure in such a way to get the properties that we want. And some of those microscopic design criteria might be chain length, which we can measure with SEC, size exclusion and chromatography. It might be morphology, right, trying to strike a balance between crystalline polymers, which are strong but might be inflexible, and amorphous polymers, which are flexible but not strong. We also want to consider our glass transition temperature, the temperature between which it basically separates glass from rubber. A low TG compound, if we want a rubbery flexible compound, we might have to add a plasticizer, small molecules. And if we want a really high melting material, high TG, then we're going to look into cross-linking like vulcanization. So from here, we'll go on to actually learning about some specific polymers and thinking about how to engineer these properties.